Hi, I'm Tony Coles, president of the Black Information Network, also known as BIN. We want to say congratulations to Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition on your 55th annual International Convention. I'd also like to take a few moments to share some exciting news with you about the Black Information Network. If you're not familiar with BIN, I'd like to kind of tell you the story behind America's first and only 24/7 all-news audio network created by and for the Black community. iHeartMedia provides news and information to over 1,000 radio stations every day, but something that for years we felt was missing was a trusted, dedicated news source to fill a void for news and information in the Black community. We wanted to make sure that in an era where fake news was driving the narrative and too many stories about our community were going untold, that we created an environment that was free from political opinion and bias of other news networks and stations. We believed that there was an opportunity to do something different. So in 2019, we began building a network of Black writers, producers, and anchors, all dedicated to a mission to not just share the news that affects our community, but to give them the freedom to share it from their own personal perspective, the Black perspective. We had no idea at the time how much this network would be needed. But because of the Black Information Network, we were able to share stories about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on our community. We provided coverage of last summer's protest, as well as the Derek Chauvin trial and conviction. More importantly, we're building this network to continue to be a voice for those who've been silenced for far too long. Heard nationally on the iHeartRadio app and now locally in more than 30 markets across America, the Black Information Network is committed to quality journalism and, more importantly, creating new career opportunities. While we're a national network, our core responsibility is always to the local markets that we serve. We make sure that our network programming also reflects what's going on in all the local communities. BIN is laser focused on Black culture, social justice, HBCUs, Black health, the COVID vaccine, Black wealth, Black-owned businesses, and of course, the Black church. We engage locally with all of the communities that we serve, and especially with the community leaders. In addition, we've added additional programming that makes sure that we're in touch with the pulse of our communities. Our public affairs program, The Black Perspective, features guests and interviews and topics that affect the cities that we serve. And we're also dedicating 30 minutes of programming every month to make sure that we're giving Black mayors a forum to spotlight their cities. The key focus for us is always making sure that BIN has a pulse on our local communities. In addition, we've also guided a steering committee. We call it the Black Information Network Advisory Board, and it provides a community connection for leaders and gives them an opportunity to make sure that they have a voice in the programming on our network and in our engagement with the local markets that we serve. We have a great opportunity to serve your communities as well. And that's why we're making sure that BIN programming is available not just nationally on the iHeartRadio app, but on select stations and affiliates throughout the U.S. Thanks again for the opportunity to share our vision with you. And I hope that you'll take time to listen and to tell your friends about the Black Information Network. Remember, we're available locally on our affiliate stations, online at binnews.com, and anywhere you go on your favorite smart device or phone via the iHeartRadio app. Thanks again, and congratulations to Reverend Jesse Jackson and Rainbow Push on your 55th annual International Convention.
For 2021, we're excited to get more people engaged and involved in Rainbow Push, supporting the programs of Push for Excellence and the Citizenship Education Fund. Now, if you're interested in public policy and you want to help change the policies that impact those who are incarcerated, you can do so. If you're interested in impacting public policies that benefit education and businesses with social economic solutions, you can do that as well. You can become a policymaker by becoming a member of Rainbow Push right now. Now, if you believe in the scholarships that we've given to thousands of students each year, you can help us out. We've awarded more than $10 million in scholarships year to date. Now, you can help young people achieve a higher education by becoming a member of Rainbow Push right now for the annual fee of only $35. And if you're a student or a senior, it's only $15. You can help us make a difference in the lives of millions. Now, if you watch us every week, or if you listen to us on the radio, or if you're viewing on social media, we need you to become a member. And how do you become a member? It's simple. Visit us at rainbowpush.org and press join. Maybe you'd like to support the work of Push. If so, it's really simple. You can do so by texting the word PUSH, that's P-U-S-H, to 41444 on your cell phone, and you can give any amount that you feel comfortable giving, or you can call us at 773-256-2775 or go to rainbowpush.org and push donate. So whenever you want to support, you can do it from anywhere. So keep pushing, because we're going to keep pushing for you and keep hope alive.
I'm so excited to have with us, I think, one of America's leading scholars in this area of criminal justice and looking at the criminal justice system, what it has meant and its impact on African Americans. As is customary at Push, we've been looking at reforming the criminal justice system, starting with arrest, detention, prosecution, every stage of the process, and even looking at some of the laws that are on the books and how African American men and women are treated by the judicial system in comparison with other races. In particular, how we are treated differently than our Caucasian counterparts. And so I thought it would be interesting, as we have this criminal justice panel that you will hear from, to hear from one of the scholars who's been writing in this area, who's done a lot of research in this area. And for the first time, many of you will meet him for the first time, Professor Arthur Garrison. And he'll tell you a little bit about himself as we look to delve more deeply into these two books that he has written. Dr. Garrison.
Hello, and pleasure, and thank you for having me. Again, my name is Arthur Garrison. I'm a professor at Kutztown University, and I've written two books dealing with race and crime and criminal justice, Race and Criminal Justice History, and Chained to the System. Both of these books engage in looking at the historical development of the American criminal justice system. Chained to the System specifically looks at the recent history of the criminal justice system, starting in the 1960s, and then with the rise of the get tough on crime and the law and order rhetoric, which has basically been the foundation of modern criminal justice rhetoric, starting with Nixon through Reagan and Bush, Clinton, Bush again, and then with the return of rehabilitation as an acceptable rhetorical political model with President Obama, and then ending with the First Step Act signed by President Trump. So the book looks at rhetoric, in other words, the story of criminal justice, the story of the policy behind criminal justice.
So when you say the story behind criminal justice, give me an example of one of the stories that you talk about in your book.
I talk about how, for example, I argue in the book that if you look at modern political rhetoric starting in the 1960s, to make a very long story short, the criminal justice system became the new model for social policy dealing with urban crime. And the answer to that rhetoric, to that question, what do we do about urban crime, was that we had the get tough policies of Nixon and the rise of the DEA in 1973. And then Reagan came in 1980. Now, I argue that to understand criminal justice policy, you have to understand general American politics. So by the 1980s, the social conservatives had fully taken control of the Republican Party. And during 81, 82, and 83, the culture wars had kicked in. One of the factors of the culture wars was criminal justice. The idea that the criminal justice system was not working. The criminal justice system was being soft on criminals and letting criminals out on bail, the various conversations that we're still having today. So in 1984, the Republicans, with Democratic support, which is another topic all by itself, how that happened, passed the 1984 Crime Act. And that is one of the two foundations of modern criminal justice that we have. That, along with the crime bill signed by Clinton in 94. So
let's hold it right there. Do you mean to tell me that in this book, you have been able to look at the policies that are driven by the executive branch of government and how they have impacted what you and I know to be the judicial branch of government, because it's the system for enforcing the laws that are placed on the books?
Yes, I have. The point of the book, actually, it starts with 1619, the slave codes, the black codes, the rise of Jim Crow, why Jim Crow came into existence, why it matters as a policy matter and then a criminal justice matter, and then the modern development of criminal justice system starting in the 1950s and 60s. And I trace that development chronologically and conceptually, both criminal justice and general policy, all the way through the first 2 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. And so I put into context the 1984 Crime Act, which gave us the 100-to-1 crack powder cocaine ratio, and then and then followed that up with the mandatory minimum 5 years, followed by the Clinton administration, and among other things is truth in sentencing, which pretty much finished off the fall of probation, as well as the overruling of the Sentencing Commission in 1995, which would have adjusted the 100-to-1 ratio, but Clinton specifically got a statute passed to override the Sentencing Commission. The only time this happened before or since. And so I traced that history along with attorneys general's policies of dealing with the issue of gun crimes and how you can elevate crimes from a drug charge to a drug charge with guns, and that can add 10, 15 years by itself. So I discussed those policies
I hate
and the history behind it.
I hate to keep interrupting because you got so much information. What made you write this book?
I wrote this book, I teach criminal justice history, and I wanted a book that put politics, sociology, psychology, legal history, all in the same book to explain the overall package. And I hadn't found a book that did that. And so that is how Change in the System came into existence. It's a follow-up to my book, Race and Criminal Justice History, which is more of a textbook, which is much more detailed in political rhetoric.
So I am just really interested and fascinated by this kind of research, because we've had Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which talks about mass incarceration situation. And so your book gets us, before we go to sentencing and incarceration, it deals with how these policies help shape and fuel what happens in the criminal justice system.
Yes, I try and the book is a holistic book that covers all of those issues, and I try and address it in a story form. So, and it's also written chronologically, so the reader would be able to get a overall view of the history of criminal justice in America and very specific issues within that issue. I also go into Supreme Court jurisprudence and explain that the Supreme Court is also a player in the get tough on crime era in the 1980s. And that is why, among other things, Fourth Amendment law dealing with use of force, as well as qualified immunity, is more of a judicial created issue than it is legislative. Now, legislature can solve that, and that's what's going on in Congress as we speak, and it's bogged down on the issue of qualified immunity. But how qualified immunity functions is actually a judicial creation by the Supreme Court starting in the early 1970s, and how they read the statute to give police officers a practical immunity in use of force cases.
That's important because almost every police department across the country, the states have passed these laws now which support qualified immunity for police officers. Many of us are trying to eliminate it because it says a police officer could violate the law and not be subject to any criminal liability, not be subject to any civil liability. You know, they may be incarcerated as we have in Chicago with and in Minneapolis with the police officers that found guilty of killing an unarmed African American, but they don't lose their pension rights. They don't lose something that any ordinary citizen would lose. And so when you did this research on qualified immunity, you found that the Supreme Court, in what case, started the qualified immunity initiative?
Well, you know, it all begins with Terry v. Ohio. And Terry v. Ohio established that the police officers can come and stop you without probable cause, reasonable suspicion. The whole genre of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence comes down to one word: unreasonable. Fourth Amendment says you have a right against unreasonable searches and seizures. The point is the Supreme Court has built the entire meaning of the Fourth Amendment around the word unreasonable. So it's a case, the court has said that any action done by police, use of force, the focus is case-by-case analysis. In this particular case, and with these particular facts, did the police officers act unreasonably? So the law is not where, the court has said that you cannot say, if the police stop you without a warrant, that's unreasonable. The court has said if the police stop you under A, B, C, D, E, and F facts, was that unreasonable? The fact that they had a warrant or didn't have a warrant doesn't settle the question. And so in the book, I walk through that jurisprudence history of how that happened. And I also walk through the jurisprudence history of the Supreme Court generally interpreting the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments in such a way that they are more prone to law enforcement than protecting individual rights, because that was the season they were in the 1980s and 90s. The Supreme Court now is under a different philosophical viewpoint in dealing with the criminal justice amendments, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments. So now you're getting cases where the court is controlling police power. And the Supreme Court, I believe anyway, has decided it is not going to take any qualified immunity cases. They've had, in the last two terms, maybe 8, 9 really fundamental questions that would have actually achieved what the statute that's being debated in Congress would have achieved. But I think the Supreme Court has decided it's not handling any more of those cases. And so any change to qualified immunity is now going to have to happen in Congress. And part of my book talks about the limitations to using qualified immunity to control police behavior, because it's mostly made to protect officers.
So this means your book, every member of Congress needs to have a copy of your book, you know, at least the Congressional Black Caucus, because it gives them the data, the tools they need to push forth this legislation. Perhaps every member of the state legislative bodies should have a copy of this book. Certainly, I never had this kind of analysis when I was in law school, and it would seem to me it would be a book that could be used in the criminal law classes, because it gives you a better understanding of why you're learning criminal procedure, and it gives you the historical frame of reference for criminal procedure and so forth. And certainly all of those students that say they're interested in criminal justice and so forth. This is like, I'm excited about this book. So how do people get your book?
The book is available on Amazon. That's probably the best way to secure a copy of the book. I reordered a few copies myself, and they can send it within a day. I recommend the book to anybody who wants to understand the interaction between criminal justice, policy, and American history, because I think one of the problems that we have in our public discourse about criminal justice is that it has no historical context, and nuances of criminal law and criminal procedure and criminal justice history are not really properly discussed. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, for my students who are soon to be police officers or probation and parole officers. I wanted them to have a sense of the history behind. One final thing. One of the things I explain to my students is how and why African Americans and non-African Americans see the criminal justice system differently. In my book, I explained that it's a truism that the two see the criminal justice system fundamentally different. My point of my book is to explain why there is a difference.
Well, so I don't want to tell everything that's in the book. They need to read the book, get the book, and get the book now. The other thing I was wondering, we have a young man that we just met that was in solitary confinement for 24 years. Have you, in your research, looked at this whole idea of solitary confinement as a means of punishment or control that's used by prisons? Have you any idea?
You know, I don't know that case specifically, but generally, that's not constitutional on its face. On its face, you cannot use solitary confinement indefinitely. Now, you can use solitary confinement for a reasonable period of time, and as I said, that's case-by-case analysis.
That's it, reasonable.
We're talking
What's reasonable?
20-something years. That's just unconstitutional on its face.
Well, it wasn't unbroken, but they just kept putting him back in solitary confinement over a period. And the question is, how long is reasonable? And like you say, it's reasonable is the standard that is so ambiguous. It could be forever, given.
Well, yeah. The problem here's the thing with understanding reasonableness and Fourth Amendment issues generally, and then due process when talking about prisons, right? It's okay. What would a reasonable officer in that situation, with the facts that officer knows at the time,
right?
Would such an officer do that? And so the battle in these cases in court is, well, what would a reasonable officer in that situation, knowing what that officer knew, do at the time? And so the court has made it very clear that that's the standard. Now, the side problem, of course, is that if you're arguing that, you need to have a case that has a fact pattern that's almost identical to your fact pattern to argue that a reasonable officer would know he can't do that. And that has been a major problem with qualified immunity, because if you can't produce that case, you could lose in a motion to dismiss. That is what the act in Congress being debated would eradicate. But that's the only way to eradicate it, because the Supreme Court, my personal opinion, looking at their cases they're not taking, they are not going to revisit that question. So it belongs to Congress to deal with that question and remove that from qualified immunity, because that's one of the major protections that an officer would have. Yeah, what I did may have been wrong now, but then it wasn't. And Fourth Amendment is about then, not what the court says now, as far as liability.
Well, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I got to finish reading your book now more than ever because it has so much to offer for those of us who are working in the public policy spaces, for those who are beyond law school. I'm just thinking you have so much that you've analyzed and researched. It would be helpful to have you testifying before Congress. I don't know if you've done it before these state legislatures about issues, particularly about qualified immunity and why we need specific kinds of legislation. And have you ever been called to help shape legislation?
No, I have not been so fortunate to be invited to testify before Congress or a state congressional, a state legislative committee. I would be honored to do so, as well as to work with you and other organizations in dealing with the issues at hand, because you raised one very important point. Getting legislation in Congress is very important because it sets a general tone. But if you really want to put your hands into changing the criminal justice system, you have to go state down, because states can pass their own statutes. And as long as a statute does not go below what the Supreme Court says, the state can do whatever it wants. It can make more protections. It just can't provide less. So passing statutes on the state level, limiting qualified immunity, or changing statutes so people who want to seek civil redress, for abuse, it can be done on the state level, and then you sue in state court, because you only have a qualified immunity issue if you go into federal court.
So this is the thing. We want you to be part of our criminal justice, National Criminal Justice Committee. As we seek to deal with police reform, we're looking at reforming a number of pieces of legislation in states across the country. You can help us shape that legislation. And I think that you are an unbelievable resource. I know you have a lot on your plate today, but we want to add Rainbow Push to your plate. Thank you so very much for joining us. How can people reach you?
People can reach me at my email. That's the best way, garrison@kutztown.edu. Best way to contact me is through my email, because I'm always looking at it.
And so you're a tenured professor where?
Yes, I'm a full professor at Kutztown University, Kutztown, Pennsylvania.
Kutztown, Pennsylvania, on the East Coast. Thank you so much. We'll be talking and sharing. I hope you will watch, and we will I'll give you some information. I'll send you some information.
Thank you very much.
I'm attorney Ben Crump, and I am so honored to participate in this social justice panel that has been convened by Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push executives. Right now, we have to seize this moment to make sure we can get real meaningful police reform in America, reform that we haven't had since 57 years, since Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society was the last time we had meaningful police reform. With the tragedies of the last year involving Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, we now have this moment. We have to seize this moment. And so, Reverend Jackson, thank you for your leadership on this matter. Let's have this important conversation so we can make sure we don't lose this moment. Our children are counting on us.
I'm attorney Robert Patillo, the executive director of the Rainbow Push Coalition's Peachtree Street Project down here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a member of the board of directors for National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I thank both of you for joining us today to have this discussion. I want us to have an open question for both of you to answer. The concept of criminal justice reform, or reforms of our criminal legal system, has in many ways become politicized over the last few years. I think many of us have understood for decades now the need to reform the system. There used to be a significant amount of bipartisan support around it. When you say reform the criminal justice system or criminal legal system, what does that mean to you? And I'll start with you, Mr. Buskey, and then you, Mr. Taylor.
Absolutely, and I think you're 100% correct that this issue has become incredibly politicized, unfortunately, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, advocates have been pushing for these kinds of changes for decades. When I think about reform, I actually think a little bit broader than simply trying to mend mend what's going on with our police forces and our court systems and in our prison. I think we need a radical remaking of how we think about criminal justice in this country. And that means a few things, but primarily it starts with reimagining what it means to be a safe and secure society, and then thinking about what role the police play in that society. And if you look at our current system, we have the highest rate and number of people in jails and prisons in the world. It is a pattern of incarceration that is unparalleled in human history. And if anyone thinks that that serves thriving populations, if it serves communities, if it serves Black and brown communities, I think you're sadly mistaken. It is not the kind of system that you would put in place if your interests were actually in making sure our societies, our communities were safe and secure. And so I think we first have to start with that very radical reimagining of what it means to have a safe society, and then see where police fit into that. And I think we'll all find that the role of police has to be dramatically shrunken in order for us to thrive as a society.
And Mr. Taylor, what does the concept of criminal justice reform or reforms to our criminal legal system mean to you in this context?
Well, I have to agree with Brandon. I mean, I've been through this for over 50 years, and I've been fighting these cases that I mentioned earlier with some success in a piecemeal way. And I've seen over those 50 years a lot of attempts at reform that usually arise when there's a strong movement or there is an exposure of extreme police misconduct, such as police torture, systemic police torture, kinds of things that are on video. In this day and age, of course, Laquan McDonald here in Chicago and George Floyd. And then that's highlighted, and the movements become extremely strong. The movements that have been on the ground and have been calling for fundamental change become stronger, so that those issues are pushed more to the forefront, and they become more acceptable to more and more people. And I think that the piecemeal reforms that we've seen, whether it be the Justice Department coming in and getting consent decrees, or it be some kind of reforms in the prison system, while those are helpful, they really don't change the fundamental nature of policing. And if we look at the fundamental nature of policing, we don't just go back 50 years, or which is my history. We don't just go back 100 years, but we go back all the way to the time of enslavement, and we go back all the way to the time of the movements, the labor movements, and what the police role in terms of the Jim Crow and the labor movements and suppressing the labor movements. And we come to understand what the police have come and always been in terms of how they don't serve the communities, that they are in fact oppressive forces within that community. And as Brandon's saying, that has to be fundamentally changed, and their role has to be shrunk, whether you call it abolition or whether you call it defunding. What you call it is not so important as to what you do about what the police role is. And you can't look at the police in a vacuum. You have to look at them in the context of all the other needs of a community, whether it be education, whether it be healthcare, all of the kinds of things that the communities in which the police are a repressive force in are wanting. And so it becomes very logical to move the money that's being spent, and a lot of that money to over-police, and to have police serving a lot of functions that they have no business serving, and move that money into serving the communities. And it would have a dual effect of reducing the police presence and the police footprint in such a negative way in the communities, and having a positive impact on alternatives to what the community and people in the community feel is necessary in order to survive.
I want to unpack that term a little bit because I think that's one of the main things that got to politicize, particularly in 2020, the concept of defund the police, which began meaning one thing, I think what you just articulated, and got turned into by the political right, this idea of just complete and total societal anarchy, where criminals ran free in the streets and beat up old ladies and so on and so forth. What does that term defund the police mean? If you could kind of break it down, and then I'll go to Mr. Buskey also. Just when people talk about defund the police, what are they actually saying?
Well, I think different people have different definitions of it. Of course, you're right. The right wing is going to demonize that, and that's of course what they have been trying to do. And they of course have a lot of politicians, particularly the president, running from that term. Because it's scary to them because of the boogeyman that you just mentioned about, the kind of crime running rampant in the streets. But if you look realistically at a place like Chicago, there's a lot of violence in the community, and the police are not solving it. They cannot solve it because the community does not trust them. The community has no option, really. And so we know that the police in the current manifestation cannot solve those issues in the community. So defunding the police, I think, is moving the money to other places other than the police. It's reevaluating when the police should be called, if at all. It's having alternatives to police when, more and more cases of police violence and police murder arise in the context of people who are having mental health crises. I have a case in North Carolina where a Black man who was homeless, who was having a mental health crisis, was trying to get to the hospital, and they ended up eight white police officers hogtying him and killing him. And we look at George Floyd and we look around the country and we see all these circumstances where alternatives to police and alternatives to the warrior mentality of police would have saved lives. And if we had alternatives, meaningful alternatives in terms of mental health professionals and others who would respond to these situations, that might help to alleviate the deaths and the injuries that are caused by police officers.
And Mr. Buskey, kind of on that same note, police officers who I speak to often say that police officers are treated kind of like the society's trash man, and that you dump the mental health issues out on the street, police have to deal with them. You dump the domestic violence cases on the street, police have to deal with them. You dump homelessness and poverty onto the street, police have to deal with it. What would a defunded police department and a fully funded social services program for a city actually look like?
It's a fantastic question, and I do want to build on some of the great points that Flint made. I would say the important element here, one of the important elements here, is to maybe refocus the conversation and say, like, even if you don't believe that the term we should apply to this is defund, certainly we can have a conversation much on the lines of what you're talking about that we hear from officers themselves in places like Houston and New York City, where they acknowledge that they are being called upon to do far too much. They often frame this as a recent development, but in truth, they've been called upon to do too much for decades and perhaps for the entirety of their history in this country. And so what we would say is, let's take a look at what the police are actually being called to do. Right? When you think about the numbers, there are about 10.3 million arrests by police officers every year in this country, every year. All right, think about the scale of that. About 5% of those cases are what the FBI might qualify as violent offenses. And I think we'd have some issues with even what's being called violent in that category as well. But taking up the word, it's still only 5% of that 10 million involve something approaching a violent act. The rest, as I think Flint was talking about, are other types of traffic offenses, right? Property offenses, things for which nobody is really in danger and are often symptomatic of things like poverty, mental health.
Just kind of piggybacking off of that, what do you think a fully, oh, it's the same question. What do you think a fully funded social services regime versus a defunded police department would look like? What kind of cases should be referred away from police and back towards our social services system? And how can we work on shrinking the footprint of police so they can really work on those violent crimes, drug offenses, quality of life crimes, those sorts of things?
Well, I think anecdotally, I think of the case that I was talking about down in North Carolina, where this man, Marcus Smith, was a member of the homeless community and of the resource center where he went every day to help others. But he had mental health issues. He wasn't violent. He wasn't a person who was going to attack people who came to help him. And prior to the incident which led to his death, he had had another incident. And this incident had happened at the resource center, where social workers and people who knew him were there. And so they could keep him calm. And so he was then placed in a police car and taken straight to the hospital and got treatment. And he was fine, and he was back in a few minutes. But this time, when he was killed and the homicide happened, the police came. There wasn't any social worker there. There wasn't anybody to talk to him in such a way that wouldn't increase his paranoia. You can imagine what 8 white police officers who are in their own unprofessional way for a while, they're tolerating how he's acting. But then they put him in a car and say they're taking him to the hospital, but they don't. They're monkeying around with paperwork and talking, and he's getting more and more paranoid, locked up in this back seat of a police car, thinking he's supposed to be going to the hospital. And so then he starts to act out a little bit, and so they let him out of the car, and they go right to the max. They hogtie the man. They treat him like an animal, put him on his face, and within 3 minutes, he's dead. That didn't have to happen. If they had mental health workers dealing with him, if they had people that could say to the cops, if they were there at all, this isn't an arrest situation, calm down, you don't need to restrain him. We can talk him into the position where he can go to the hospital, get his medication, and be back as a useful member of the homeless community. That anecdotally is a way I think you could look at this issue. If you did this across the board and you gave these people the authority to countermand police if they're called to the scene, or come instead of police, I think a lot of these circumstances, which are more and more frequent, and we have to understand these situations are more and more frequent because the services are being cut back, and people who would normally be getting treatment and in hospitals or in centers are being turned out on the streets because they're closing down their mental health centers. So you have more and more people on the street who have some kind of serious mental health issue, and then you send the cops to deal with them when they act out or they go off of their medication or whatever the case may be. So you need to reverse that radically in terms of, number one, you got to increase those services so those folks with the mental health issues, with the homelessness issues, get the services they need. And then when they need some other kind of services, that you send the right people to help with that, to de-escalate, rather than to act like cops are trained to act like, boom, he's acting out, he kicked my squad car, that's a broken window, I'm going to have to report it, let's hogtie. That's what happened in our case.
One of the issues that I think that we see from trying to make any significant public policy gains in this arena is kind of this cycle. You have a police brutality or an excessive force incident. The city leaders respond by trying to rein in police violence. The police respond by mass sickouts, by refusing to patrol certain communities, by mass retirements, those sorts of things. violent crime spikes, then the community calls on political leadership to roll back those criminal justice reform efforts and those police reform efforts. What do you think needs to be done to break that cycle, to have those sorts of lasting police reforms put in place?
Well, I think that one of the major issues, and it's a way towards defunding the police and reining in the police, is true community control of the police. That's been that battle here in Chicago. And they just reached a compromise the other day between the community groups and the politicians and the mayor. But unfortunately, like so many other reforms that they are forced to make over the decades, the power still remains in the hands of the mayor and the police superintendent. So you have to be worried about whether this reform actually will change the fundamental relationship between the police and the community. But what you're raising in terms of the cycle, a very reactionary and racist and powerful component of that cycle is the police unions. We saw it in Minneapolis when in the George Floyd case, but we've seen it here in Chicago over the decades, how the union stepped forward to defend the cops who assassinated Black Panther leader Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. We see it in terms of the FOP having stepped up to defend and fund the defense of John Burge, the serial torturer here in Chicago, who was in charge of torturing with electric shock and suffocation and other medieval means over 125 people of color over a 20-year period. And that union is very powerful. And it speaks a very reactionary and racist voice that the power structure in these cities tend to be very much intimidated by. And even if there is a progressive aspect of the police department, that voice is normally drowned out by the Fraternal Order of Police or the police union. So there has to be some reining in of the police unions by the power structure in the various cities, and reducing the police union to dealing with issues that have to do with contract, and not allowing them to control issues of community control of the police. And that's a major, major battle, because when community organizations are fighting for community control of police, they're often not just fighting against the mayor and the politicians, and they're not only getting resistance from the police department itself, but on the right flank, they're getting a very powerful resistance from the police unions.
What we've seen in many cities, particularly, I'll use the example here in Atlanta, Georgia, where we put in an anti-chase policy, saying police officers couldn't chase individuals because there's been more collateral damage done by that than any law enforcement goal that's been achieved. Reviewing officers' use of force, we saw when the two college students were tased here in Atlanta for literally no apparent reason. The two police officers were fired, but then upon review, they were rehired. We saw in the Rashard Brooks killing at the Wendy's, where an individual was intoxicated, and instead of them calling an ambulance to deal with the issue of somebody being drunk, they escalated the situation into a point where the individual ran away and was then killed by the police. But what police officers are arguing is that cities are taking away their ability to police, that by not allowing them to chase, not allowing them to use chokeholds, not allowing them to hog tie people, so on and so forth, that they're unable to police. How do you strike that balance between effective policing and also respecting the rights of the individual?
Well, the balance at this point is way out of whack. I mean, the police department have all these tools that you mentioned, and they are trained to use them. So you need to some degree, to disarm them. You need to put them in situations only where they can't or are encouraged not to use that force. And there's an interesting approach that was taken in New Orleans, of all places, and that had to do with peer intervention, with training police to intervene to stop the violence of their partners, of their associates. I mean, you see, in my case, in North Carolina, there was a sergeant on the scene. He just stood by and let the hog tying happen. And then he wasn't disciplined afterwards. There was no real investigation of him. The corporal on the scene was involved. They could have stopped it. Instead, they didn't. So the peer intervention, if it's bought into by the chief, as it was in New Orleans at the time, and they radically cut the amount of police brutality and police shootings in New Orleans during that period of time, that they were actively pushing the idea of peer intervention and saying to the cops, look, you're going to get in more trouble if you do this rather than you back off. And if you have supervisors who are very strongly trained to do that, and you have bosses who are trained to do that and buy into that, then you can stop this violence before it ever starts. And rather than having a code of silence and the cops go through the training academy and they get X amount of hours on diversity and all that good stuff, but they get on the street, and the first day they're on the street, the training officer says to them, this is how we do it out here. Forget what you learned in the academy. Instead of that, if you had a training officer, in fact, in Minneapolis, Chauvin was a training officer. They didn't want to intervene with him because he had some kind of rank and seniority on him. And one cop who actually did say something about it was just rough to the side. So there's a training officer showing in an extreme way what you do on the street. If in fact it was the opposite, and that training officer stepped in, or the sergeant in my case stepped in and stopped it and said, there's another way to deal with this. Then if that's a policy and within the entire department from the chief on down, then you might have some changes on the street.
Mr. Taylor, we were just discussing how can we strike the balance between the type of reforms we want in policing while also having effective policing, because many people are blaming this last year's crime spree, our rise in violent crime nationwide, on the efforts at criminal justice reform from last year during the revolutionary summer of 2020. How do we strike a balance where we can both have effectively policed and neighborhoods, but also not the types of abuses we've seen previously?
I think the first thing to understand is that there's really no evidence that policing actually make us safer and that police response actually reduces violent crime. What we know from the pandemic is that many of the things that you would often associate with high crime rates are occurring. You've got massive joblessness. You have a number of people who have just been trapped in their homes without outlets. You have more people who are owning weapons. And so these are all situations that require a broader social response than simply throwing more police at the solution. And so I think that the balance starts with recognizing that simply throwing more police at the problem is not going to be the proper solution. And we've really got to continue on the path that we've started of saying we have to begin to think more about how we create more employment in this country, how we fully fund education, how we do all these things that we know when in place actually do reduce crime, and stop relying on the failed strategies of the past few decades that have said whenever you see crime rates increase, or even when you don't, the proper response is to put more officers on the streets. And I think that is one that takes a lot of fealty to evidence, because many of the people who are going after, say, bail reform in places like New York City are often saying, well, we can blame it on the fact that we are now not trapping people in cages prior to trial. And they make these claims without any evidence whatsoever. But when you look at the evidence, you see that addressing mental health crises addressing employment, addressing all these other social ills really does get to the core of what we're trying to solve when we're thinking about improving public safety.
And kind of piggybacking on that, we've seen some novel attempts at criminal justice reform nationwide. You mentioned bail reform, for example, in New York. The city of Atlanta is closing down their city of Atlanta jail and referring those releasing nonviolent criminals on their own recognizance to return. The state of Oregon has simply decriminalized most low-level drug offenses. The city of Baltimore is no longer prosecuting low-level crimes such as solicitation and truancy, those sorts of things. What are some things that legislatively can be done by city governments and state governments that would help to reduce this number of police interactions?
Yeah, I think those are wonderful examples. Another example that I was going to mention before my internet failed was Brooklyn Center. And I think it's a good example that gets right to the heart of your question, where after the shooting of Dante Wright, the community there passed sweeping legislation, the city and its city council, essentially remaking its police department and saying, we don't want armed police responding to traffic offenses anymore. And so they've now taken that function out of the police department and put it into a separate public safety division. And those individuals who are now going to be going out and enforcing non-moving traffic violations will not be armed police officers. They will be ordinary civilians who are simply enforcing the traffic code. They are also putting in a mobile crisis unit. Again, not a response dictated by the police, but I think if I heard Flint correctly, one that does address what happens so often when the police come out is you've got somebody in a mental health crisis and you have police officers who are responding with weapons who are not properly trained to handle that situation, who then go in, perhaps with implicit bias based on race, and escalate the situation. And what places like Brooklyn Center are doing is saying, why don't we send in professionals who are actually trained in how to address these situations, social workers, psychologists, et cetera, who can de-escalate and prevent the worst outcomes from these encounters. And I think that's how we begin to think about how we reduce the footprint of the police while also increasing public safety.
All right, and Mr. Taylor, I want to ask you kind of the same question. What are some things that can be done legislatively by city councils, county commissions, state governments in order to reduce the number of negative police interactions?
I think that Brandon hit the nail on the head in terms of the moves that are being made in Brooklyn. There have been some moves made here in Chicago in terms of bail reform. We look to some of the more progressive prosecutors around the country, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. You look at Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. You've got Kim Foxx here in Chicago and others, Rachel Rollins, I believe in Boston, other places that have elected progressive prosecutors. Now, that isn't a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, because they're taking over entrenched prosecutorial offices who enforce the code of silence in every day and work with the police and have the same kind of attitudes that the old line police officers have. But over time, if the community supports politically the reforms that the prosecutors are supporting along with the legislators, that there can be some meaningful change in terms of mass incarceration, for example, and in terms of sentencing and that kind of thing. And if the police are not reinforced by the prosecutors in terms of the obvious perjury that they give in so many cases, and the kinds of cases that they bring to the prosecutors, then that may have some impact on the streets in terms of how the police enforce the laws and what circumstances they do and do not enforce the laws.
I think one of the big things that is often brought up is trust between the community and police departments. So what do you think is the genesis of the lack of trust, particularly between African-American communities? As I look at a picture of Fred Hampton behind you and law enforcement, and what can be done to work on bridging that gap? I'll start with you, Mr. Taylor.
Well, I'd actually defer to Brandon on that first, because he seems obviously to be in touch with the community in Brooklyn, and I certainly would like to hear what he has to say, and then I'll follow up if that's all right.
No problem. Brandon, go ahead.
You have asked a very big question, and I think when we talk about where the bonds of trust have broken down, I think you really do have to go back to the beginning of policing in this country, and start with the fact that one of the first police forces in our country was in Charleston, South Carolina, as a slave patrol. And I think Mr. Taylor mentioned several times the fact that police in this country have been used to enforce the suppression of labor movements, have been used to enforce the aftermath of slavery, and to make sure that Black people weren't able to make ends meet after emancipation. And that has continued. And there's been just wonderful writing about how in places like where I'm from, New York City, during the kind of crime rise of the 70s and 80s, you had Black communities who were asking for, in many ways, more protection from what was happening. But what we forgot is they weren't just asking for more police, right? They were asking for more social services, more support. And what they got instead were things like stop and frisk in New York City. What they got instead was the militarization of the police, where now the federal government is sending tanks to places like Ferguson. And so when there is unrest after the killing of Michael Brown, you see tanks rolling through the center of an American city. And I think that it's those kinds of interactions when Black and Brown communities are saying, we want more support, not only from police, but elsewhere, and all they get is more use of force, more arrests for petty offenses, more social control, just as it has been from the inception, then that's an trust. And I think that's a big part of why we have such a disconnect in this country.
Mr. Taylor?
Well, I have to say amen to all of that. That certainly has been my experience. It's certainly not a person of color. I haven't experienced the same way as people who have, such as Brandon. But on the other hand, having clients and friends and comrades over these many years who work in the community and who are part and parcel of the community, there are lessons that I have learned, certainly that resonate in the same way that Brandon has been saying. And just how can a community trust the police when they do what they do on a day in and day out basis? How can people come and tell the police, well, this person did this in this case, when in fact they know what's going to happen to that person is going to be racist. It's going to be a part of mass incarceration. Or on the other hand, the police are just going to not even bother, which is the other half of the equation. Either they facilitate the mass incarceration, or they show complete indifference to the victims of the crimes. So you have that combination that goes back to the inception of police in this country. And it's at a real tipping point now, I think, because as Brandon mentioned, you look at the responses in Ferguson, but look at the responses to the Floyd demonstrations that swept across this entire country. What did we have? We not only had the tanks and we had the feds coming into the cities. We had this massive show of force for people who were peacefully demonstrating. And so, yeah, there's no reason for the community to have any respect for the police. There's no reason for them to want to reach out to the police. And that's why it's so important to have community control of police, so that the community can shape the policing. And I think another aspect that can be funded would be violence interruption. which is woefully underfunded and underappreciated aspect of dealing with violence in a community. The people who have suffered the violence and the people who in an earlier part of their lives might have been perpetrators of that violence are now the interrupters who are bringing alternatives. That and the concept of restorative justice as well. There are concepts there that if they were adopted along with defunding as we've defined it here this afternoon, could have some really important impact on how the community viewed not only the police, but viewed the entire system, which has oppressed them for so many decades, all the way back to the inception of this country.
Well, you know, we saw after the Justice, the Freedom Summer of 2020, all these great proclamations. Corporations said they would give, I think, a total of $50 billion, much of which is not materialized. We saw cities paint the streets to say Black Lives Matter. We saw corporations, commercials and flags and logos and everything else. But what we haven't seen is legislation. We haven't, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has stalled in the Senate. Even Tim Scott's Justice Act, the Republican legislation, had stalled and was not able to get out. What needs to be done legislatively? If you're going to give bullet points to what can be done on either the state and local level or the federal level in order to help to tamp this down, because right now, as you said, it seems that there's too much power in the hands of the police unions and not enough in the hands of the people. What needs to be done legislatively? I'll start you, Mr. Taylor, and then you, Mr. Buskey.
Well, I can't profess to be an expert in legislation. You know, I find that this gridlock to be kind that the Senate and Mitch McConnell throws up in terms of anything that is meaningful in terms of legislation, whether it be police reform or other kinds of meaningful legislation, makes me feel that I can be kind of shooting in the wind in terms of a wish list of what this Congress is going to do. I think in some ways what we have to do is resist what these state legislatures are doing in the field of voter suppression and in the field of policing. And, you know, a lot of these red states are passing legislation that, you know, anti-riot legislation, legislation that permits people to drive into demonstrations and kill people, basically. So a lot of what we have to do is resist the legislation and resist the cases that come up. To fight back against the tide that's ongoing in terms of that politics, the Trumpian politics, the right-wing politics that continues to push so much of the legislation in the states and to push the legal cases. We really have to fight back against that as well.
That's all absolutely correct. And you know, I do want to really leave people with the sense that, as we've said for so long, you know, politics is very local. And as we see the entrenchment of the Congress on something like the Justice and Policing Act, I think we've got to really buckle down locally and look at what communities can do on their own to make this reform real and to also demonstrate that these reforms do actually work. And you've got so many examples around the country that could just tick off, right? We talked about Brooklyn Center. There's also Eugene, Oregon. There's Rochester, New York. I mean, all these communities that are experimenting with policing in new ways that don't require convincing Mitch McConnell that they are correct. And that can also continue to put pressure, of course, on the national conversation. And so when we look at the state level, you know, things like decriminalizing minor offenses, right? If we are convinced that the police should not be enforcing certain kinds of drug offenses, certain kinds of traffic offenses, I think we then have to ask the question, well, then why are they on the criminal books anyway? Why are people going to jail for these types of offenses anyway? And I think that can take a huge chunk out of why police are on the streets enforcing low-level offenses to begin with, right? But again, the emphasis here is on the local. But that said, I don't want to forget about what we're doing at the national level. And notwithstanding the gridlock in Congress, there are some things that we do need at the national level. For example, getting rid of the doctrine of qualified immunity, which essentially allows police officers and also other government officials like prosecutors not a get out of jail free card, but essentially keeps them from being held liable in a court of law when they commit very egregious wrongdoing. We also need some national accountability for police officers. We talk about how many people are killed by police every year, but it's all done through these estimates collaborated by groups like the Washington Post and others, because there's no centralized federal registry to track how often officers are killing people. Think about that. We don't know how often, we don't have a reliable metric of how often police are taking the lives of those they are supposed to serve. And we need things like that and other measures to ensure better transparency at the national level to make sure we have a better picture of what's really going on with policing, even at the local level, because that data is so critical to understanding the direction of reform.
As we get close to an ending point here, I do want to give you guys the opportunity to give advice to the average person, just the average individual. What can they do from a personal level in order to help affect changes in the criminal justice system and in our criminal legal system? Clearly, if we could solve this problem during a 1-hour conversation, all of our pay grades would be far higher. But what can the individual person do to help effectuate change? I'll start with you, Mr. Buskey.
I think you have to realize that you've got power and you have to get out. I mean, I think the one thing that's been so heartening in all of this, even though we do have gridlock in Congress, we do have this backlash in states like Texas against protest movements, but it's all a reaction to the wonderful power that we saw exercised in the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd and in those uprisings, and realizing that the power of the people is real. And when people band together like the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups, change often occurs. And when you have to demand accountability for police departments, you can make a difference. We talked a little bit about some of the progressive prosecutors who've been elected in recent years in this country. And we have to recall, that was considered politically impossible a decade ago. To have somebody like a Kim Foxx or like a Larry Krasner was considered irrational, I think even just a decade ago. But now it is part of a movement. And that began with people in those communities realizing that their votes mattered, and that if they got out and if they made their issues known and they made their elected officials accountable to those issues, then they could change who was in charge of local governments. And I think that's why we have to realize that we've got so much power stored up locally that we can't let go to waste, and we can't let be jeopardized by all the other efforts going on to suppress the vote and other things that really do enhance democratic accountability.
Thank you so much. Mr. Taylor?
Well, I certainly agree with that, and I second it. And I would cite to a specific example here in Chicago, which arose out of the police torture struggle. And there was an intergenerational, an interracial movement that has spanned decades in this city to fight against John Burge and police torture. And back in the around 2014, an idea that had been germinating for many years and got its impetus from the broader reparations movement back in the day was to seek reparations for people who were survivors of police torture. And because of that movement, because of the movement on the street, because of that intergenerational, interracial movement, it forced the city of Chicago, its mayor, and its council people to pass a very unique reparations ordinance, which brought not only financial relief to survivors of tortures who had no legal redress, but most significantly brought non-financial relief, which included a center on the south side of Chicago for survivors of torture and police brutality to come and get treatment, a memorial, which is still being fought for here in the city for the torture survivors, and job training, and most significantly, teaching the torture scandal to 8th and 10th graders in the city of Chicago's public schools. And that was a remarkable accomplishment that was made by people, regular people, who fought to raise this issue in a political context and were successful. And now that concept of reparations in police violence cases is being talked about and being brought to various other venues in cases, so that now we're not just talking about settlements and financial relief in cases where there's extreme police violence, but we're talking about other aspects of relief, non-judicial relief, as it were. And also we're talking about education. And that's another thing that people can do, is they can learn about these struggles, they can learn about the history of police violence, and they can bring it to other people. They can bring it to young people. They can talk, they can write. That's kind of what we feel is an aspect of being a people's lawyer in the People's Law Office, is not only to fight in the courts, but to bring what we know and what we understand to people in the community. So people in the community can do that as well, and they educate themselves and educate others, and then you have what you have germinating here, and what we've seen in the last year or two in terms of a very powerful movement that Brandon has talked about.
Absolutely. And in our last couple of minutes, we'll give each of you the opportunity to give a closing statement, and also talk a little bit about your organizations and how people can get in contact with you, follow you on social media, and get involved with everything that you're working on. We're going to start with you, Brandon, and then you, Mr. Taylor. So Brandon, closing statements and how people can get in contact and follow your organization.
Thank you, Robert. And I should say for all the work that you've done and continue to do. One of the questions that we often ask is this moment different? And given all that we've seen, I'm old enough to remember the Rodney King beating and the acquittal of those officers, and on through the decades, right? Is this moment different? Are the uprisings after George Floyd really going to lead to real reform? And my resounding answer is yes, because we have to. We are at such a critical moment in this country, and I think everybody who cares about these issues has to approach this as life or death, as an existential crisis for our country, but one that we can meet, again, if we are committed not only to seeing things change at the level of the president, Congress, and federal legislation, but also what people can do in their own communities, and how people can take on the responsibility of making sure that they are defining what it means to be safe, and that they are also in that process shrinking the footprint of the police to really and truly serve the community. And I think that's what gives me hope. The fact that we have seen so many of these examples across the country. We are obviously still very far away from that new reimagining of the police function that I think is so necessary, but we are also so far along in the journey already. And I think what's important is for folks not to lose that momentum, and not to lose that belief that things really can be different this time. I think that's often where movements fall short, is the frustration over the years of not seeing your efforts to fruition. But I think that's a necessary part of where we are in the struggle. And the ACLU is very committed to seeing this through. We are, I think our function here has been to really support these movements, to support the right to protest, to support the right to sue government that has exceeded the bounds of the Constitution, but also to make sure that these democratic voices that we're hearing in these communities get heard in every way that we can. So you can find us at aclu.org. Check out our page, check out all of our issue areas, but especially our pages on policing and our criminal justice system. And sign up if you've not done so already. But even if not, we will be there to support you whenever you're in the streets looking to change how policing works in your communities.
Thank you so much to Brandon Buskey. And Mr. Taylor, final comments from you.
Yes, I want to thank Brandon and I want to thank Rainbow Push for inviting me to be on this panel. And I've had a very strong working relationship with Rainbow Push and Reverend Jackson and Reverend Wilson, Jonathan Jackson, and all of the folks at Push for decades now. And we certainly totally stand shoulder to shoulder in this fight. I find that after 50 years of fighting these struggles, some days you feel a little pessimistic. As Brandon mentioned, he mentioned Rodney King, and of course I go all the way back to the assassination of Fred Hampton and all the torture cases. But I find optimism and strength in looking at younger people, looking at the people in the streets, looking at this generation of people who are raising issues in a different way. They're raising issues that 5 or 10 or 15 years ago would be put outside not only the mainstream, but outside those in the movement. That being abolition of police, that being defunding the police, that being abolition of prisons, that being abolition of solitary confinement, for example. The progressive prosecutors that Brandon mentioned. All those things are things that are now within the discussion, the dialogue. They're within the realm of possibility because people are talking about them and people are fighting for them. So I like to say when I speak that I want to turn to the younger people. I want to turn to the people in the streets. I want to turn to the people who are raising these issues and learn from those people and to support their struggles and to continue to fight with them on those struggles. But I also want to caution them to listen to their elders, that there's a lot of history that can be learned, whether it be the history of the murder of Fred Hampton, whether it be the torture struggle, or whether it be the mistakes that all of us made over these years and decades and generations. So there's a give and take here. We get our strength from you all, the younger folks, and you should hopefully get some strength from us and the fact that we're continuing to stand side by side with you in this fight. And with regard to the People's Law Office, we're now we will be celebrating our 52nd year of existence in about a week. You can read about us on our website, peopleslawoffice.com. There are also, I've written a book called The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago, which talks about some of the issues that I've mentioned. My partner, Jeff Haas, has written a book called The Assassination of Fred Hampton, which talks about that case. And those are some other ways you can learn about the fights that we've been involved in and some of the things that we've done over these many years. So thanks again. I really appreciate being involved in this discussion. And I hope to have contact with you, Brandon, because you sound like you're doing great work and we need to be in touch.
I would love that. I would love that. And I'll fix my internet before we talk again. So,
all right. I want to thank both of you so much, Mr. Flint Taylor from the People's Law Practice, and also Mr. Brandon Buskey of the American Civil Liberties Union. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Attorney Robert Patillo from the Rainbow Push Coalition. I would encourage all of you to join at rainbowpush.org for more information and more sessions such as this. And as Reverend Jackson would end all these sessions, I want all of you to make sure you keep hope alive. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
When I think of Rainbow Push, I think of two words: social justice.
Education advocacy.
Political empowerment.
Freedom and equality.
Global humanitarian.
Evolutionary, revolutionary.
Political change.
Inclusion, evolution. Push Excel.
progress, justice.
Jesse Jackson.
Not divisiveness.
Equality and perseverance.
Corporate partnership. People united.
Push yes.
I'm Otis Moss III,
I'm Frederick Douglass Haynes III.
and we are here simply just to say to you about an incredible organization known as Operation Push.
Can I be admitted?
No, sir, you cannot be admitted. Why? I am not going to serve you.
Because of my race? Operation Push has been here for us even when we didn't know it. As a matter of fact, a lot of the doors that you walk through is because of the fact that somebody knocked those doors down.
I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody.
And because of Operation Push, when it started as Operation Breadbasket, after the assassination of Dr. King, they decided to build an organization that were people united to save humanity.
Just what is Operation Push?
Well, Operation Push is a civil economics organization. It's a religious organization with an economic mission. And we believe that the black church is the political and spiritual salvation of our people. And it is to that extent that we challenge churches and churchmen to get involved.
And so we are simply asking those who have been blessed by Push to join the movement.
That's right. And if you do that, I promise you, you are blessing the next generation. And that's what we need, generationally, to bless those who come behind us, just as those before us made sure that we could have what we have. That's Operation Push, pushing doors open. But we can't push if we don't have your hand involved.
We want to turn on the gas. We want to turn on the water. We want to sell the clothes. We want to sell the cars. We want to be men. We want self-determination.
And it was Jesse Jackson who was the young man of the movement and now is an elder statesman. And we've got to make sure that we have another generation that will be pushing forward, another generation that will be building an Operation Breadbasket, another generation that will be talking about new economic strategies for those who are poor.
And ensuring that we are never politically disenfranchised. I hope you already recognize that there is a movement afoot to rob us of what we fought so hard for and shed blood for, and that is the right to express our voice through voting.
If blacks vote in great numbers, progressive whites win. It's the only way progressive whites win. If blacks vote in great numbers, Hispanics win. When blacks, Hispanics, and progressive whites vote, women win. When women win, children win. When women and children win, workers win. We must all come up together. We must come up together.
We need you in Rainbow Push to make sure we are politically empowered and enfranchised.
There is no other organization like Rainbow Push, and we encourage you to make sure that you join and financially support. If we don't support it, no other organization will. It is our duty, it is our job to support our organizations.
We got to do it. Grassroots organization, hitting the streets and challenging those in the suites. That's Operation Push.
I like that. I'm Reverend Otis Moss III.
Hey, I'm Frederick D. Haynes III. He's rubbing off on me.
Make sure you join Operation Push, Rainbow Push, today.
Keep hope alive.